welcome everybody today to the Tennessee Fish and Wildlife Commission meeting. Today's February 13th, 2014, and this is Committee Day meeting. My name's Jeff McMillan, and I'm the chairman. At this point, time I'd like Ms. Barbara to do a roll call, please.
Jim Bledsoe.
Here.
Harold Cannon.
Here.
Bill Cox.
Here.
Jeff Griggs.
Here.
Jeff McMillan.
Here.
Tom Rice.
Here.
Jim Ripley. Clayton Stout. James Stroud.
Here.
Trey Teague.
Here.
David Watson.
Here.
Jamie Woodson. We have a quorum.
Thank you, Ms. Barbara. Before we get started, Director Carter, do you have any comments you'd like to make?
I do, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. I know some of the commissioners have had a tough time getting here because of weather up in East Tennessee and further south in some of the areas. So I just wanted to mention a couple of things our people were involved in over the last day or two. As the weather ramped up, as usual, they activated the Tennessee Emergency Management Agency's Emergency Operations Center. Steve Nifong, the Assistant Chief of Enforcement, is our primary EOC, the Emergency Operations Coordinator for the agency. Steve was calling in at 6 o'clock yesterday. Actually, they called at 6 o'clock. Steve was down at Montgomery Bell, made his way up there, and they began talking about activating the center and what they would like us to do. And as usual, I won't go into all the details here, but as usual, when there's a weather event like that, whether it's a tornado or floods or anything that kind of necessitates people who are used to working in the outdoors and have a properly equipped to do that, they generally lean heavily on our agency. So they started talking about interstates and some of the back roads and what they could do for response. Just wanted to mention that they began talking primarily about the interstate assistance on I-40 in the Cumberland County area. And our major in that area, C.J. James, working in conjunction with the EOC and with Steve, mobilized some of our people, and two of our officers especially stood out. Officers Fortner and Cannon began patrolling that part of the interstate, pulled several people back onto the road out of the ditches that were stranded, utilized some of the time that they had in just administering to people who were stranded on the road but weren't stuck, so taking those people, and actually began in the middle of the night cutting trees out of the interstate where they had fallen over because of the weight of the snow and opening those back up. So the next morning, that being this morning, the first thing at 6 o'clock this morning, they began to brief the rest of the EOC, and the first thing off the topic was the outstanding job that the Wildlife Resources Agency personnel had done in those areas up to there in responding to the snow emergency. That continued into the next briefing, and then General Hastings, who's the Adjutant General for Tennessee for the military department, came in and continued that. So I just wanted to say all that to let you know that it's work that we've come to expect. It's just the ordinary that our guys do, but it's really nice to know that they get that recognition from a lot of other people, and I really wish that the state in general knew how much our guys and gals do in response to any of those emergencies. So I just wanted to pass that on for one thing. The other I wanted to mention to you, sent out an email to you. We have a new commissioner that Governor Hanselem has appointed to fulfill Julie Schuster's vacancy when she left 2 months ago now, I guess. Connie King from Clarksville will take her place. She has yet to go through confirmation, so she can't be on the commission or have a vote at this particular time, but Connie has been named to that spot. I've had the pleasure of knowing her for just a little while. I think you'll be very pleased when you get to know her and the contributions she'll bring to the commission. And last thing, I wanted to mention just one other thing in relation. We've had the last 2 days have been pretty busy down on the Hill with not only appearing before the Ag Committee but also our budget committees, and I know Chris is going to give you a briefing about that later. But I just wanted to mention one thing to you that we pointed out that I thought you might be interested in too. The last survey that came out from the U.S. Census Bureau, from the United States Census Bureau, along with Fish and Wildlife Service and others who cooperate in funding that, the latest figures for this year in this survey that comes out every 5 years, hunting and fishing in Tennessee creates 26,389 jobs and contributes $167 million in state and local taxes to the economy of Tennessee. That does not include the boating program, which I don't have the most recent figures, but the one prior to that generated $2.5 billion for the state of Tennessee. So So I want to mention those to you, and we've put those out before the committees down there to know how much the programs that you and the people inside the agency put forward, and the sportsmen and women of the Tennessee Fund, and what they do for the economy. So just wanted to mention that to you. Appreciate the time.
All right, thank you, Director Carter. I know that our agency was very involved when we had the floodings here in Nashville, and also our officers, I know, I'm sure that they weren't exactly getting extra pay to extend themselves and help people like that. So it's great for our agency, and it's great that we have that type of people that work for us. Is there any other announcements from the commission? Okay, well, I'd like to welcome our guest today, and I noticed that Senator Mike Bell's with us today, and we certainly appreciate your presence, and we certainly appreciate you being a friend to this agency and also to the commission. I'm very thankful, and any time that you'd like to address us, feel welcome to. I'd like to invite anybody who wishes to address the commission if they would come to the podium and state their name and the subject matter which they're concerned with, and try to do it at the appropriate time of the committee that we're involved in at that time. So I do reserve the right to limit the conversation if it gets redundant. So if that's also at this time, we'll move on to the Wildlife Management Committee. Chairman Trey Teague.
Thank you, Chairman McMillan. At this time, I'd like to introduce Darrell Radijak to discuss the agency's strategic plan.
Thank you, Commissioner Teague and all the other commissioners. I have been bestowed the honor and the privilege of presenting to the Commission TWRA's new strategic plan. What the strategic plan hopefully is the guiding document which more or less tells not just you guys but the general public pretty much what the function of the agency is. And again, it is quite the privilege of presenting this to you. What I will be presenting is going to be something completely different than what anyone has been used to in the past. The focus this time when we were putting together this strategic plan moving forward was to really change gears with how we do business as an agency. And our director, Carter, challenged us to move from a species-based plan to more of a habitat-based plan. And we did that. And what I want to do, I believe everyone was sent the strategic plan. Most of the commissioners received it a while ago. We sent this out to the public back in December. But I will go through it as easily as I can. It's a fairly lengthy document. I believe it's 80-some pages, but I will more or less just hit the highlights of not only what we did, but why we did a lot of these things. So if it pleases everyone, I shall get started. Before I talk about this new plan, what I want to do is just give you a little bit of history about the old strategic plan. And I mentioned in 2006 to 2012, these strategic plans are usually on a 6-year rotation. They're required by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And the last one we did, obviously you can see it's already a year or two outdated, but it was the 2006 to 2012 edition. And if you look at what's inside it as far as the chapters and what the agency is supposed to do as a state agency, it was broken out into 19 individual chapters. And the one thing I want to tell you is prior to 2006, if you looked at all the previous plans going back probably 40 or 50 years, it was set up very similarly. And so the chapters that you see within there are mostly species-based. You see bear, deer, turkey. We even had rough grouse, squirrel. There was lots of species-specific information that was contained in our old strategic plan. And so one of the things that we wanted to do is try to get away from this. I need Bobby Wilson to plug his ears, but I will tell you the fisheries folks were some of the more forward-thinking folks, because if you see, they address community fisheries, large rivers, reservoirs, and so they were already doing something that we've been tasked with to do as far as developing a habitat-based plan. The other thing I wanted to tell you is there was a really strong focus in last year's plan and all the plans before that regarding restoration. Tennessee, as you know, early 1900s, there's a lot of animals that were not present or if they were present, were in very small numbers. And so our strategic plans, beginning when we first started putting these together, there is a very strong focus on restoration. We got to restore the animals to desired populations. And by and large, for the most part, we've done that. Whether or not it's game or non-game animals, the wildlife species found within the state of Tennessee are primarily pretty healthy. There's some things we could do here and there, but animals pretty much no longer need to be restored anywhere throughout the state. And so we took that plan and we more or less, we tried not thinking about it anymore. Like I said, the director challenged us to come up with a new way of thinking to take us forward, to take the agency forward into the next, not just the next plan, but into the next few decades, into the next century. And so we pretty much had to scrap our way of thinking. And I don't know if you could see this, but what he did is he told us, all right, come up with something new. We need this new approach. And I don't know if you'll see this, but we sat there and that's what we came up with. This was a few years ago. We sat around, and here, if you didn't catch it, I'll do it again because it's a really great effect. We were drawing a blank. We didn't know what to do. I don't mean this in a derogatory sense, but our agency is pretty much made up of guys, and guys really are stuck in the things that they like to do. And especially some of the older gentlemen, if it wasn't broke, don't fix it. Let's just keep doing what we do. And unfortunately, that doesn't work today. Especially since we broke out of that phase of restoration, and we're more or less trying to figure out how do we manage, how are we going to care for the wildlife resources from this point forward. And so it's kind of difficult for us to think outside the box because we were very successful with the things we did in the past. So what are we supposed to do in the future? And so actually in late 2011, this was almost to 2012, we approached DJ Case and Associates. They're a very well-recognized group that provides advice and a lot of other services for wildlife agencies. And we called them up and we said, hey, here's what we're doing. We have to rewrite our strategic plan, and for the most part, it was a species-based plan. And we don't think that's what we need to move forward. And so they took on that challenge, and they did what was more or less a strategic plan assessment. They looked at all the other states and wanted to see how they wrote their strategic plans, and then they were going to come up with advice for us. And so they picked out a couple of the plans that they felt were best, and they came out and they published this. I believe you have seen it in the past, but it was an assessment of all those other strategic plans from other states to give us advice on how to move forward since we've never done this before. And a couple of things that they hit on 4 points that really hit home. First off, if we're truly thinking about doing things differently, we need, as an agency, to embrace the change. If we got to get out of this restoration mode and more or less do things in a different manner, we need to accept it as an entire agency. The other thing, they said, you're not going to get anywhere if you have too many people, too many ideas. You have to more or less create a core team to put this thing together and rely on that core team to more or less create this plan. And then when you're creating it, one of the first things you've got to do is create a really strong and solid vision and strategy that everyone agrees with, that you truly believe is going to carry you forward into the future. And the last thing, and this is important, you'll see more of it further on in my presentation, but they mentioned about incorporating SWAP. What SWAP is the State Wildlife Action Plan that our non-game folks develop for the species of greatest conservation needs. For the longest time, we kept talking, in fact, I started this discussion now talking about moving from a species-based plan to a habitat-based plan. And they said it's not an either-or question. You don't do one or the other. What you need to do is do both of them. And so you don't have to select one. And what they referred to, or pointed us to, is our SWAP plan that was created. It was an award-winning plan on how we manage all those other wildlife species. So why don't we parlay that into managing all wildlife in Tennessee? Because that plan was not either or, habitat or species. It was a combination of both. So they said, try to incorporate everything that you did in SWAP into this new strategic plan. So with that advice in mind, we finally knew what we wanted to do. And so we put together a team. We developed our core planning team, and if you want, I can tell you who they were later. But they're pretty much the most forward thinkers within the agency. And they came from all different programs, the fisheries guys, the wildlife guys, the law enforcement guys, even I&E. We brought some of these folks in and we sat down and said, how do we do this? What are we looking to put together? And so we more or less were sequestered in a cabin, Camp Marymount, for a couple of days, and we brainstormed. What is it that TWRA does? What is the primary function of our agency? And so after many discussions, it was quite comical because we had those big memo Post-it notes that were plastered all over the room as like new wallpaper before we're all done. But we put in a couple of 12, 14-hour days just trying to come out of that meeting with what are the core functions of the agency. And it's funny because people looking in from the outside, though we were working nonstop throughout that process, we would come out with just a piece of paper with a couple sentences. But we truly were working. But what we came up with right off the bat was pretty easy for everyone to recognize. TWRA is there to manage our wildlife resources. That is probably our number one responsibility. It's what we're mandated to do. So that was more or less a gimme. But then some other ideas started coming out that were never ever referred to in the old strategic plan. Keep in mind that old strategic plan that talked about all those species, that was the only facet of it. It only talked about managing our resources. But when we sat down and we talked about what our agency does, it became very apparent that this was a huge part of our agency, outdoor recreation. The director just recently mentioned how much money that brings in. In fact, I'm going to have a slide a little later on that shows you the importance of this. But one of the things that our agency does, besides protecting the animals and the fishes, is that we provide outdoor recreation first and foremost primarily to our hunters, fishermen, and boaters, but a whole slew of other groups as well. And so as a state agency responsible for the citizens of Tennessee, this is a huge, huge component and something brand new that we've never ever done before. But then we got to thinking, well, what else do we do? And obviously, law enforcement was a huge thing that we never included in our old strategic plan. We cannot protect the resources, we cannot protect the citizens unless we have a very strong and solid law enforcement arm. And so this obviously was a core function of our agency to provide that service to the citizens of Tennessee. And then lastly was the I&E. Unless we tell people what we do, unless we show people what we do, unless people can hear or read or just learn about what we do, our agency is not going to function well at all. And so what we had to do, those ended up being the four core functions, the four tenets of what this agency is going to be doing this point forward, going into the future. I promise you this is going to be the only small rating that I'm going to put up there, but we ended up coming up with some goals for each of these four functions, and I'll go through one at a time. Wildlife resource management, our goal for that is to conserve and manage wildlife resources to provide diverse wildlife communities at appropriate levels. It literally means we're going to manage the wildlife resources. Now keep in mind, whenever I say wildlife, according to TCA, wildlife includes not just all the mammals, but all the fishes as well. So it's an all-inclusive term, and I'm not forgetting that aspect of our agency, but we're lumping it all together. And so literally, we're going to manage our resources. This outdoor recreation, I'm actually very thrilled with what the goal of this is, and I'll tell you the point that I think is so very important. But it's to increase opportunities for hunting, fishing, and boating, and accommodate other outdoor recreation that's safe for users and the environment, yet consistent with conservation principles. That second half of that statement we worked on quite extensively, and like I said, it's one of the stronger aspects because we recognize right away we cannot accommodate everyone. There are some things that people want to do on our WMAs or in other places that may be safe, but it might not be friendly to the environment. It may actually be friendly to the environment, but it's not friendly to the wildlife. And so there's certain things that we really have to keep in mind when we determine whether or not this is something that we get behind. Our law enforcement, the goal for our law enforcement program is to protect and conserve Tennessee's fish, wildlife, habitats, and public boating opportunities by providing public safety through proactive and responsive law enforcement services. Obviously, that's a gimme. Everyone understands the importance of our law enforcement And lastly, I&E is to supply both the public and the agency personnel with constant flow of multimedia information necessary for attaining the management and conservation goals of the agency. And there's a little bit more there, but it's more or less what I just said. They've got to tell people what we do in order for people to support us. So these 4 things became the core of our new strategic plan. So when you read it, the 4 big chapters are those 4 things right there. Now, where do we go from here? Look, each chapter, I'm going to go through the chapters just to tell you, if you do go through and read, why we did what we did. When Director Carter challenged us and said, move towards more of a habitat holistic approach to managing our wildlife, it was quite a monumental task, because literally we had to put every square inch of Tennessee in a very simple document. We could write a very exhaustive plan that would be as thick as a telephone book, but we were limited in the amount of pages that we could use. So we more or less had to have this 30,000-foot view of things, and we literally had to cover every square inch of Tennessee. And so we did that by breaking up the entire state into 7 primary habitats. What I'm going to do, I'm not going to go through each and every habitat. I'll mention all of them, but I'm just going to do a breakdown of one of them so you can see how the other 7 are written about in this new strategic plan. So one of the first habitats we identified, and we threw out different ideas on how to do this. We were thinking of dividing up by physiographic region or cover types, but what we fell back on is we had to go very, very simple. So the first thing we broke it out in grasslands. There's grasslands all throughout the state. I don't know what percentage. I believe it's up to a quarter of all of Tennessee would be classified as grasslands. And it was quite simple. It was literally beautifully simple in the fact that when we referred to our SWAT plan, that State Wildlife Action Plan, it already broke up these habitat types into different groups within each and identified those. And so, for example, grasslands, it's broken out into 6 different types. You have prairies, glades, balds, old fields. Those are habitats that are natural habitats that support wildlife and are beneficial to wildlife. The bottom 2, the pasture and cropland, are not so much very friendly to wildlife. Obviously, wildlife will feed in cropland, but pasture and cropland, we don't consider that really good wildlife habitat. And so, according to the SWAT plan, we know exactly what type of habitat we need to manage for in order to keep our wildlife happy. And so as you go through the plan, if you do take time to read it, it will talk about different objectives for each one of these habitat types. And I'm going to, again, use only grasslands as an example. One of the objectives in grasslands is to maintain or increase acreage of native grassland and other early successional habitats on TWRA-controlled lands. And so prairies, glades, balds, old fields, that's the native grassland, that's the early successional habitat. That is what we need to be striving to increase or to maintain. Another thing, another objective within the grasslands is to maintain or increase the acreage of agricultural lands that were converted to native wildlife habitat on private land. So besides doing our agency-controlled lands, there's this private land component. So more or less, it says the exact same thing. We need to manage for really strong, good, productive wildlife habitat. And so as we mention those objectives, there's obviously issues and problems to go along why it's sometimes difficult to do these things. And so we identified different strategies throughout this plan on what our agency will specifically do to address these goals and objectives. For example, strategy 1, conduct inventories of grassland species. This is to reassure not just the commission, but even folks within our agency, we're not getting away from species management. We've still got to monitor for quail and deer and turkey and all those game species. And so it's written throughout this plan that we're still going to have a focus on the animals that live in these habitats. But other strategies it lists utilize burning techniques to more or less increase the productive wildlife habitat. And so when you look at the grassland section, it tells the agency what we will be striving for and how we're supposed to attain the goals that we list for this particular habitat type. And so that was the example that I'm going to give. The other primary habitats that we identified, which is going to, again, going to cover every square inch of Tennessee, is forest lands. Obviously, this is a huge component of the state. I believe 65 or almost 2/3 of Tennessee is covered by trees, and we need to manage those trees properly. A big component in West Tennessee, obviously, is wetlands, but it's not just productive for waterfowl and wading birds. Wetlands are hugely important when it comes to the environment itself. Obviously, there's flood control, but it's a natural filter for purifying water. So wetlands are extremely important to protect and preserve. This next category is, I'm glad we came up with it, because if you took that aerial view and looked down, you would never see it. But it also is extremely important to our wildlife resources, and that's karst, or another term for that is the cave systems. So although you don't see it when you're looking down from above, those holes in the ground provide extremely important habitat for a number of our wildlife resources, in particular bats, but there's a tremendous amount of other species that also benefit from the karst habitat. And so that takes care of all the terrestrial side of things. There's also a huge component in Tennessee that consists of the aquatic side, and we're bringing the fisheries thing back in here. Again, fisheries were very forward-thinking in the last plan. They specifically wrote about streams and rivers and some of these other things, so they really didn't have to, there's really nothing new in the way things were written. They've had this all along since the last plan was created. But one of the habitats that they identified were streams and rivers, and this is going to take care of all the flowing waters, from the smallest little stream up in the highest mountain all the way to the Mississippi River. So every order of stream there is taken care of. They also identified impoundments. More or less, I guess the best way to think about that is where the water's not flowing that heavy. They're the structures that TVA put in to back up some of our rivers and create some of the reservoirs. So all the reservoirs are covered in this section, but this section also includes things like small lakes as well as even ponds. And so there's a whole section dedicated to how to manage impoundments. And then once we had all that we were looking at, we said we covered pretty much everything when it comes to wild things. But there's another component here that when you look at the aerial view, especially at nighttime, you see lots of lights. And so one of the sections that we felt was extremely important that we needed to address, especially moving forward with our agency, is this urban setting. There was, I'm sure some of you have seen it, but just recently in the last Time magazine, the front cover was America's Pest Problem. And it talks all about wildlife, not just deer, but all wildlife becoming a huge issue, especially in the urban setting. So we had to address what TWRA will be doing from this point forward as far as managing urban animals. Oops. And so those were the 7 primary habitats that we identified, which was going to cover every single aspect, every square inch of Tennessee. So we thought we were doing great. And then we got into something that we realized we're going to be doing an awful lot of writing, because there's these extrinsic factors that affect wildlife populations that are common in every single habitat type, whether it's grassland, but even in the aquatic side of things. And so we started throwing out some ideas to say, man, TWRA does this, we got to continue doing this, but we don't want to write about it 7 different times, so let's create our own chapter. And what we realized quite quickly is that habitat doesn't cover everything when we're dealing with wildlife. And so the first thing that we realized is nuisance or overabundant animals. And again, this ties very tightly with some of that urban stuff, but we do have issues of overabundant animals, and especially with nuisance animals. We have an ADC program that we maintain, and we still want to have oversight with that, but we also have to start thinking about how we're going to deal with these issues and these overabundant animals, because more than likely these problems are going to grow tremendously over the next few decades. So we need a way to address that. But besides nuisance and overabundant animals, there's extirpated natives. This was something, and I'll refer to it right before I finish. This was caught by one of the public comments, and they said, you ought to have a section about that. And so we recently created this. what the extirpated natives is animals, native animals that should be in Tennessee that aren't, or they're no longer in their historic range, so to speak. And I put a picture of a bear up there because that's one of our biggest issues right now. Bears have more or less moved and are taking over the Cumberland Plateau. And so, although bears aren't extirpated from the state, there are certain parts of the state where they've been gone, and we got to learn how we're going to address that. We've done human dimension surveys to find out public attitudes of some of these animals coming back. And besides bears, we don't have these now, but I promise, probably within the next 5 or 10 years, cougars are going to be showing up in Tennessee. The southeastern boot of Missouri has a small population of cougars, and as long as they can figure out how to get across agricultural lands, these things are going to be showing up. And so we have to have an idea what will happen in 10 years when they first arrive. But besides those mega fauna creatures that everyone cares about and everyone understands, there's lots of other creatures that we're also dealing with. Bill Reeves has worked extensively with projects restoring hellbenders. And so there are a lot of animals that we will continue to go into that restoration mode if we can do it, if it's a feasible project to undertake. But that's one thing that we've got to think about with some of the species within Tennessee. Another thing that was a big problem with our agency is invasive flora and fauna, and that's just the fancy-dancy way of saying plants and animals. And so there's things that are found in Tennessee that really shouldn't be here. I think the two that everyone is familiar with, and they realize it takes up a tremendous part of what our agency does, we have the issues with silver carp in our waterways and wild hogs on our landscapes. And we've got to come up with a way to deal with this, because this is tremendously one of the biggest obstacles and biggest issues that our agency is dealing with. And recently, Bobby and his crew were out and they caught one of these things. We are praying that we got them all. And when Bobby cooked up the silver carp sometime last year, those bacony flavor ones, you don't realize what you're eating. Anyway, invasive flora and fauna is a huge issue with our agency moving forward. Besides the exotic species, we also have diseases, especially diseases that affect our native flora and fauna, plants and animals. And so we've got to come up with a way to deal with that. Fish diseases. The good thing right now is we're not really dealing with any natural fish diseases. We're concerned about fish diseases in our hatcheries, and they could be a problem. But Bobby told me that there's a new disease that's recognized in the wild up in the northern states called VHS. They're trying a new counter, I think it's DVD or DBR, which is supposed to wipe VHS out, but that was a joke. It didn't go over too good. Anyway, it was bad, I know, I'm sorry. Should have tested that one. Besides fish diseases, there's mammal diseases. White nose is really affecting our bat populations, or has the potential to affect our bat populations. It has absolutely devastated the bats up north, and we're crossing our fingers hoping that it doesn't have the same effect on our bat populations here. I meant to find out how many counties in Tennessee are white nose positive, but it's a growing number every single year, and it's a tremendous concern for us because it kills bats by the tens of thousands up north. But there's other diseases. EHD affects white-tailed deer. CWD, hopefully that never comes to Tennessee, also affects white-tailed deer. But besides the fish and the wildlife, there's some diseases that affect the plants in Tennessee, which are critical to our wildlife. Eastern hemlock is seeing a tremendous decline due to a woolly adelgid, which attacks the tree and ends up killing it. And so we have diseases that are grave concern to healthy ecosystems that our agency has to keep an eye on and hopefully combat. And the last but not least factor of this thing that could potentially affect wildlife populations is climate change. People can argue the cause of it, but what you cannot deny is the fact that there's some things going on that could affect our wildlife. So whether or not it's increased floods, increased droughts, if it changes the landscape over a long enough period of time, the wildlife populations that are in those areas will be affected. Another thing, and Bill Reeves, again, usually speaks mostly of the climate change, is some of these weather events that are extreme, whether or not it's tornadoes or hurricanes or extended periods of cold. These things absolutely will affect local populations when they come through. So what we have to do is more or less learn how to address all these things, disease, invasives, climate change, understanding that from this point forward, these are things we're going to have to recognize and adapt to. So when it comes to wildlife resources, that's pretty much what's contained in Chapter 1, which is by far the biggest chapter of this strategic plan. So if you don't have questions, I'll just go through the other